Hello, everybody. This is Mike History 2, and this is going to be part 2 of my last video about Germany's planned new order after World War II. So, last time I talked about Europe and the Reichskommissariats that Germany wanted to establish there. And so today I will be talking about Germany's plans after the war outside of Europe. So, Hitler's geopolitical thoughts about Africa always occupied a secondary position to his expansionist aims in Europe itself. His public announcements prior to outbreak of the war that Germany's former African territories be returned to it served primarily as bargaining chips to further territorial goals in Europe itself. Africa was nevertheless expected to fall under German control in some way or another after Germany had first achieved supremacy over Europe. Hitler's overall goals for the future organization of Africa divided it into three parts. The northern third was to be assigned to Italy, the central part would fall under German rule, and the remaining southern part would be controlled by a pro-German Afrikaner state built on racial grounds. In early 1940, Foreign Minister von Ribbentrop had communicated with South African leaders thought to be sympathetic with the Nazi cause, informing them that Germany was to reclaim its former land of German Southwest Africa, then a mandate of South Africa. South Africa was to be compensated by being given Swaziland, Basutoland, Bechuanaland, and Southern Rhodesia, which at the time were British. On the division of French African territories between the Spanish and Italian governments, Hitler refused to provide any official promises during the war, however, fearful of losing the support of France. In 1940, the General Staff of the Kriegsmarine, or the Navy, produced a much more detailed plan accompanied by a map showing a proposed German colonial empire in sub-Saharan Africa, extending from the Atlantic Ocean to the Indian Ocean. The proposed domain was supposed to fulfill the long-sought German goal of Mittel Africa, which is Middle Africa, and even further beyond. It would prove a base from which Germany could achieve a preeminent position in Africa, just as the conquest of Eastern Europe was to achieve a similar status over the continent of Europe and allow Germany to dominate both continents. In contrast to the territories that were to be conquered in Europe itself, these areas were not planned as targets for German settlement. The conquest of vast territories across Africa was mainly economic, and it would provide Germany with most natural resources that would not be able to find in Europe, as well as an additional nearly unlimited supply of labor. Racialist policies would nevertheless be strictly enforced on all inhabitants, meaning segregation of Europeans and Africans, and punishing interracial relationships to maintain Aryan purity. The area included all of former German territories in Africa, as well as additional parts of the French, Belgian, and British territories in Africa. These include the French and Belgian Congos, northern and southern Rhodesia, Nyasaland, southern Kenya with Nairobi, with northern Kenya being given to Italy, Uganda, Gabon, Ubangi, Chari, Nigeria, Dahomey, the Gold Coast, Zanzibar, nearly all of Niger and Chad, as well as the naval bases of Dakar and Bathurst. A second part of the plan entailed the creation of a huge string of fortified naval and air bases for future operations against the Western Hemisphere, spanning much of the Atlantic coastline of Europe and Africa, from Trondheim in Norway all the way down to the Belgian Congo, as well as many offline islands such as Cape Verde and the Azores. A less massive but similar initiative was planned for the east coast of Africa. In 1942, a secret diplomatic conference was held between Germany and Japan, in which they agreed to divide Asia along a line that followed the Yenisei River to the border of China, and then along the border of China and the Soviet Union, the northern western borders of Afghanistan, and the border between Iran and India, and back then that also included Pakistan. This treaty, of which a draft was presented to the Germans by Ambassador Hiroshima, was rejected by the German Foreign Office and the Navy, as it allocated India to Japan and limited the Kriegsmarine's operations in the Indian Ocean. However, Hitler had no problem with this treaty, and it was signed on January 18, 1942. However, it was a problem for Axis cooperation in the Indian Ocean, because crossing the boundary line required consulting the other country, which was long and complicated. This made any joint German-Japanese offensive against British positions in the Middle East impossible. Japanese operations against Allied shipping lines during the Indian Ocean raid had become highly successful, along with the attack against Ceylon, but these were not followed due to the German-Japanese strategic cooperation. The Germans vigorously maintained watch on the demarcation line and objected to any time the Japanese crossed the line into what they considered the German sphere, of the Axis world. Therefore, the Japanese were forced to cancel a planned massive invasion against Madagascar, since the island was in the German sphere of influence. Now, moving on to Oceania, Germany's former territories in the Pacific, which had been given to Australia and New Zealand after World War I, according to the Treaty of Versailles, were to be sold to Japan, at least temporarily, in the interest of the Tripartite Pact, which was its official alliance with Japan. Australia and New Zealand were designated as future Japanese territories, although Hitler lamented his belief that the European race would disappear from those regions. He nevertheless made it clear to his officials that descendants of the convicts in Australia were not Germany's concern, and their land would be colonized by Japanese settlers in the immediate future. Which is an opinion also shared by Joseph Goebbels, who expressed his conviction in his diary that Japanese had always desired the so-called Fifth Continent to immigrate to. After the planned conquest of the Soviet Union, Hitler planned to intensify the war in the Mediterranean. The High Command of the Wehrmacht produced studies concerning an attack against the Suez Canal through Turkey, an offensive towards Baghdad Basra from the Caucasus in support of revolting Arab nationalists, and operations in Afghanistan and Iran directed against India. Hitler did not actually want to conquer the Middle East and was most likely to allow Italian domination, at least over the Levant. The Jews of the Middle East were to be murdered, as Hitler had promised to the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem in November 1941. Turkey was favored as a potential ally by Hitler because of its important strategic location on the boundaries of Europe, Asia, and Africa, as well as its extensive history as a country hostile to Russia and later the Soviet Union. To make sure that Germany wanted to work with them on a long-range basis, the Turks were guaranteed an equal status in the German-dominated order and were promised a number of territories which they might desire for reasons of security. These included Edirne, and allowed Turkey to take land from Greece, the creation of buffer states in the Caucasus under Turkish influence, changing Turkey's borders with Iraq and Syria, as well as the settlement of the Aegean question to provide Turkey with suitable protection against Italy. The Black Sea was also to be given to Turkey as part of its sphere of influence, because this would get rid of the need to station a German navy in the region to replace the Soviet Black Sea Fleet. Crimea was nevertheless to be fortified to ensure permanent German possession of the peninsula, and the Black Sea was exploited as an unlimited resource of food. Anyways, Allied occupied Iran was also to be drawn into the Axis camp, possibly by the means of an uprising. So, the possibility of Iran as an anti-Soviet country was already considered in the 1930s and coincided with Hitler's declaration of Iran as an Aryan state. In fact, the name Iran means homeland of the Aryans in Persian. Changing a Persian's name to Iran in 1935 was done by the Shah at the suggestion of the German ambassador to Iran as an act of Aryan solidarity. However, the Iranians had always called their country Iran, and this was way before Nazi Germany ever existed. So, on the eve of World War II, Germany was Iran's biggest trading partner, followed by the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States. During pre-war diplomatic maneuvers, the Office of Foreign Affairs took special interest in Afghanistan, believing that Germany had failed to exploit the country diplomatically during World War I, despite the Niedermayer-Hentig expedition. The objective was to ensure that the country would remain neutral during a possible German-British war, and even use it militarily against India or the Soviet Union. Despite the Foreign Office's good relation with the Afghan government, Foreign Ministry under Ribbentrop favored overthrowing the current government and restoring the rule of Amanullah Khan, who had been living in exile since 1929. After the French-German armistice of 1940, Afghanistan asked Germany about its plans on Afghanistan's future, especially concerning the post-war borders of the country. So Afghanistan hoped to see the reincorporation of 15 million ethnic Pashtuns, which had been placed in India thanks to the Durand Line, and the securing of the northern Indian border so that an expansion towards the Indian Ocean became possible. However, since the Nazi-Soviet talks of October to November were going on, Germany didn't really want to make any promises to Afghanistan. And finally, Saudi Arabia under Ibn Saud was seen as a natural ally and was to be given land in Southwest Arabia and Transjordan, and a post-war Greater Arab Union under German domination was discussed. Hitler generally had a very low opinion of Indians, and he considered the British rule in India as an exemplary one, despite the fact that, they starved millions of people, but then against Hitler, of course, he would like that. And so he intended the German rule in the occupied East to resemble it. Hitler thought little of the Indian independence movement, declaring them to be racially inferior Asiatic jugglers. And as early as 1930, he spoke of the independence movement as the rebellion of the lower Indian race against the superior English Nordic race, and that the British were free to deal with any subversive Indian activists as they like. In 1937, he told the British Foreign Secretary Edward Wood, 1st Earl of Halifax, that the British should shoot Gandhi. During the same discussion, Hitler also told Halifax that one of his favorite movies was The Lives of a Bengal Lancer because it depicted a handful of superior race Britons having control over the subcontinent. Now, Nazi ideologist Alfred Rosenberg, who I discussed in the last video, stated that although the Vedic culture was Aryan in origin, any Nordic blood had been lost because of racial mixing. Like Hitler, he viewed the British rule in India as desirable. Now, during the first years of the war in Europe, as Hitler sought to reach an arrangement with the British, he held the notion that India should remain under British control after the war, as in his mind the only other alternative was Soviet occupation of the subcontinent. As the British had rejected German peace offers, Hitler ordered on February 17, 1941, to prepare a military study for a post-Russian conquest operation in Afghanistan against India. The goal of this operation was not so much to conquer India, but to threaten British military positions there to force the British to come to terms. Hitler held the United States in contempt, stating that it was half Judaized and the other half Negrified, and that insofar if there are any decent people in America, they're all of German origin. As early as 1928, he had maintained that Germany must prepare for the ultimate struggle against the United States for hegemony. In mid to late 1941, as Hitler became overconfident of an Axis victory in Europe, he began planning an enormous extension of the Kriegsmarine, projected to include 25 battleships, 8 aircraft carriers, 50 cruisers, 400 submarines, and 150 destroyers, intended against the Western Hemisphere. Hitler also considered the occupation of the Azores, Cape Verde, and Madeira in Portugal, and the Canary Islands in Spain, to deny the British the staging ground for military actions against Germany, and also to gain Atlantic naval bases and military airfields for operations against North America. Hitler wanted to use the islands to deploy bombers against American cities. In July 1941, he approached Japanese Ambassador Oshima with an offer to wage a joint struggle against the United States. In the final battle for world domination, he expected the British to eventually support the Axis with its large navy. And finally, we get to my country, which is Canada. Now, featured fairly little in Nazi conceptions of a post-war world, he politically grouped the country together with the United States in an American-dominated North America and considered it equally as materialistic, racially bastardized, and decadent as its southern neighbor. The country was noted for its abundance of natural resources, and because of its great geographic size, coupled with a low population density, was described as a country without people, in contrast to Germany, which was considered as a people without space. In his 1934 account of Canada, German journalist Colin Ross described Canadian society as artificial because it's composed of many different parts that weren't tied together by either blood or long-standing traditions, and that for this reason one could not speak of a Canadian nation. And because of both these factors, the Canadians were deemed incapable of comprehending true culture, and German immigration in Canada was considered a mistake because they would be forced to live in a so-called empty civilization. Well, that was kind of insulting to my country, but regardless, this is Hitler, so what do you expect? Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe.